Today on trade, we're going to talk about the triangular one. Now, the reason a triangular pattern exchange occurs is to balance demands. Direct trade between two regions aren't necessarily useful to both parties. Difficulties occur when imports don't come from where exports go. To accommodate for the disparity, another region must participate, but not as a middleman. For example, Port A exports to Port B, and Port B exports to Port C, and Port C exports to Port A, so everybody's happy. During the age of sail, which lasted from the 16th century to the mid-19th century, trade routes were affected by ocean currents and the wind. This resulted in voyages from Europe to Africa, Africa to the Caribbean and/or Americas, and from there back to Europe. The most notable model following these routes is the Atlantic triangular slave trade. It's important to know that these were not necessarily routes followed by ships. Instead of heading straight back to Europe, a ship could have gone to the American colonies first. The triangular trade model is a generalization of patterns in exchanges. Let's take a closer look.
Using clothing materials shipped over from the cotton plantations, they created much wanted finery, desired all over Europe and parts of Western Africa. Manufactured goods were then shipped to many ports to be used as trading items or as payment for slaves. These slaves were then shipped over to the Caribbean and the Americas as a labor force that would produce raw materials, completing the triangle. Unlike the natives of the New World, Africans were, more or less, immune to the diseases Europeans carried and spread. This made them an excellent long-term workforce.
The Middle Passage, corresponding to the fact that this was the middle or second leg of a three-part voyage, was the worst part of the journey. Along this route, slaves were brought from Europe and Africa to the New World, living on decks within the ships that provided less than 5 feet of vertical space. The slaves were held captive by shackles. Men were clasped at the ankles in pairs, whereas women and children were generally given a little more room. With 300 to 400 people occupying the small decks with little ventilation and nowhere for human waste to go, disease was prone to break out among the slaves. Diseases including smallpox, syphilis, and measles. This caused the deaths of many before they would reach the New World. Many preferred to die instead of facing what lay ahead of them, but since slaves were so valuable to the captains who transported them, they tortured those who tried to commit suicide by starving or jumping off board if there was a chance. These slaves were never expected to see their families again once they left the mainland of Africa. Out of the estimated 9 to 12 million slaves that reached the New World, about 2 million died at sea.
After a long and treacherous journey, the ships arrived here in the New World. The ships unloaded their slaves at either the ports of the Caribbean or the ports of the American colonies. Once at their destination, the slaves were then sold to plantation owners to work the field. After selling their slaves, the ships were then cleaned and prepared to make the journey back to their European ports. Accompanied with sailors back to Europe were massive amounts of hemp and tobacco from Virginia. From the West Indies, the ships took back sugar, rum, and molasses. Other materials, such as cloth, were sent back to Europe to be turned into the latest fashion trends. The money made from selling the slaves purchased many of the items that were shipped back to Europe.